Hello, can you people hear me out there? This is Bob Randall, and we're getting things lined up for our webinar at 1 o'clock. If you have a second to throw a chat out there and make sure everything's working okay, that'd be great. All right. Looks like it's working for most people. We'll get started here in about 2 or 3 minutes, right at 1 o'clock. So a couple minutes, we'll get things going. All right, great. Looks like everybody is kind of logging in, getting started. So I think without further ado, we'll get things moving. Again, welcome to those of you tuning in to our webinar on employee engagement. We're excited to go through what we think is some pretty interesting content that hopefully becomes actionable for all of you as well. So first things first, I'll introduce myself. I'm Bob Randall, and I will be walking through all of the webinar for you today, and I look forward to getting to know all of you afterwards. But in the meantime, a little bit on myself. I've worked in the corporate world for 25 years in various capacities, both domestically and overseas, managing sales, marketing people, manufacturing environment, mergers, acquisitions, all kinds of really interesting things. And I came to be very passionate about this topic over the last several years as I did my doctorate in organization development, and really tried to tune in on how the work environment has such an incredible factor on results and on employee satisfaction. So as we work through all of this, I look forward to talking to you about some of the basics on employee engagement. First things first, we do have a chat box available, so if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to tune into the chat box, and I'll be looking at that throughout the webinar and trying to answer any questions along the way. And if we have time at the end, we'll open things up for questions at the end of the webinar as well. If you have any connection issues, no worries. You can always tune in. If you have to leave and reboot, not a problem. And if there ends up being a problem at the end, this is being recorded and we will share this later. So if you want to check it out at another time, it will be available for you. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We're going to go through employee engagement and define that. It's a field that's somewhat in its infancy. And I think there seems to be a bit of confusion. There are a lot of different definitions on what it is. What is employee engagement, and we'll try to hone in on a common terminology and definition for it, which I think is really important. And through that, we'll talk about where did it come from? How did we get to where we are today through the historical underpinnings? And we'll talk about what people do today to measure engagement and how we are, from a very high level, doing with employee engagement here in the United States. And then why employee engagement matters so much to people. It's a hot topic, and we'll connect that to why it's such a hot topic throughout the webinar as well. So without further ado, we'll dive right in. The definition of employee engagement. Again, there have been a lot of discussions and papers and articles written constantly about this topic. And what we want to do is kind of take things back to the basics and talk about what is employee engagement at its core. And what we did is we researched a bunch of different articles. We put a couple of them up here in the webinar, some seminal articles, one from SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, another one from Forbes magazine. And as we were able to kind of hone in on the definition of employee engagement, it really became clear that there is one kind of universal definition of what it is, and we have it here checked at the bottom, that employee engagement is the level of commitment employees have to their organization and their jobs. And what we want to do is talk a little bit about what that commitment really looks like. So what is really meant by commitment? Well, we look at it in three different ways. The first one is the emotional commitment that employees have, and those are the feelings that they have. It's if you go to the heart that people have and how they feel about their jobs, their colleagues, the leaders of the organization, just sort of how they feel walking into work in the morning. That's sort of the subjective emotional commitment that they have to their jobs and to their organization. People also think about commitment in terms of their head. So how do they think about their organization? And this is where people think through, like, is what leadership doing? Does that make sense? Does a strategy make sense? Does the organization make smart decisions, in my opinion? And that's kind of where they're using their head to think through what they think about is going on in their workplace. And then thirdly, how do those feelings and thoughts play out from a behavioral standpoint? And what kind of share of mind does the organization and my job have in terms of my discretionary time? So we'll dive into a little bit of that as well. But when we talk about commitment, we can really drill down on what that really means. And that will come into play with how we end up measuring engagement as well, which we'll talk about here in a second. So just a couple of examples on how emotional commitment looks when you have a highly emotional, committed workforce. These are people that feel proud of where they work. They like to tell their friends and neighbors where they work and why they're so proud of the place that they work. And these are just people that are very connected to their coworkers, and they just feel valued and appreciated. They just feel really good about where they work. Now, of course, on the flip side, there's always a shadow side to everything, and we can recognize low emotional commitment when people they might feel embarrassed about where they work. Maybe there's something in the newspaper about their organization that they're not very proud of, or something that's been happening in the workplace that people are not proud of. Or maybe they're lacking trust in the workplace, or a particular employee feels kind of like a cog in the wheel and they don't feel like they're really making a positive impact in what they're doing every day. So these would be some examples of, people having kind of negative feelings about where they work. So we'll kind of take a break from the definition just for a second here. And I wanted to just pivot for a minute to talk about, well, what would you do in the case where you might have a particular employee who isn't feeling very good about where they work? So here's kind of an action step that you could take if you're interested. It could be a friend, or it could be a coworker or an employee that reports to you that feels burned out. Maybe they're uninspired or unfulfilled with what they're doing. And one thing that I've particularly found to be very helpful, and I do this in my MBA classes that I teach, and it typically has a very positive effect on people, is to walk them through a coaching session. And we take this from appreciative inquiry change methodology, which was really spearheaded by David Cooperrider about 10 years ago. And we've adapted his process for change to an individual coaching situation. And we take this to the 4 Ds of appreciative inquiry. And this is something you might do if somebody is feeling drained, or this could be at lunch, this could be in an office. It could just be a more focused coaching session where you walk the other person through these particular questions, where you ask them to, first of all, in the discovery phrase, let's go back to the best parts of your job and let's focus on the positive aspects and what gives you the most energy. And that kind of starts to open up the person to maybe reflecting back to a period of time where they felt really good about the job that they were in or the organization that they work for. And it kind of helps them remember some of that positiveness can come back up to the surface on why they entered the organization or that job in the first place. And then we get them to do the dream phase, which is what does your dream job look like? This is sort of blue sky. Open up your mind and think through what could that look like for you. And this is kind of an exciting phase. It's a little blue sky. So what we do next is we kind of hone them in back to reality on the design phase. And so kind of back to where we are in this organization, how could we better design your job in a way that invigorates you? And this kind of makes it more real for them. And there might be some tweaks. There could be some development things that could be happening with this employee. It's really a discovery phase, in the design phase, what you're really doing is trying to figure out some tangible things and processes that you can put in place to help that particular person really get excited about their job and feel better about it in the end. And that's what you do in the final D, which is the destiny and deliver phase, which is really create a tangible plan to help them get into the position and be more excited about what they're doing. So what you really want to do, and what the founder of employee engagement talks about, Dr. Khan, is really creating more of a partnership with employees rather than a top-down process with them to help them become more excited about what they do. And the idea of co-creating that with them gives them a very strong voice in that and gets buy-in immediately from them. So those are some tangible things that you can do when you run into employees that are not feeling good about their job. So back to the definition of employee engagement, and we also dive into the cognitive side of that, which is how people, their beliefs and how they think about their organization. And this is kind of what's in their head about it. So you might believe that the organization has a great future, the strategies all line up, and that makes really good sense to you. You see the organization making really wise decisions and investments in people. And you really understand how your job impacts the overall results. So those are some examples of where people would have high cognitive commitments to their organization. And of course, on the flip side, you can have people that think the opposite of that. So they're seeing decisions maybe that don't make sense to them, and they start to become disengaged because maybe their boss doesn't feel it is up to the task, or they don't feel like the organization is moving in the right direction. So a couple of examples of where cognitive commitment comes into play. All right, now we're going to switch over to how those actions play out. So the behavioral commitment comes when we talk about the discretionary effort that is put forth by the employee. So this is where people spend their personal time on the behalf of the organization in their job, because their job in the organization might be energy giving to them, and they really enjoy, brainstorming with coworkers. They might be interested in developing themselves through a graduate program to help improve and apply their skills there. I know personally, I've fortunately experienced this earlier in my career. I had a job where I was being challenged. I was able to travel the world and really was given a lot of opportunity at a very young age. I entered an MBA program when it didn't seem I had time, but I wanted to do all of that because I really, really thought and believed in the mission of the organization. It was growing, and I thought I was really part of something really, really neat. So reflecting back on that, I can recognize that I had very high behavioral commitment to my job at that time, because I probably drove my friends a little bit nuts once in a while because I was talking about my job more than they would have appreciated, but I was really excited about it. And maybe you can think through a time where you had that same sort of feeling and those behaviors came out in the same way. Of course, on the flip side of that, when people are not committed to their job, and that can happen cognitively or emotionally, this is where the behaviors come out, where people start to shut down. They might start looking and spending their time looking for another job. They might be the complainers. So you can typically recognize this type of behavior pretty quick, and you can think through what you might do in those particular situations. And there is another action item we put together for you today, just something to think about. If you've ever been part of a department, let's say of 10, 12, 16 people, where it seems like people have shut down and maybe there's an opportunity to kind of re-engage with people. One thing I found that works really well in those situations to get people to kind of get reinvigorated and recommitted to what's going on is to conduct what we call a World Cafe. And this is a time where maybe you spend 2 or 3 hours, you get the whole group together, and it's very participant oriented. So you kind of set the process in place, and then you let everybody in the room kind of take over from there, where you set up the room with different tables. Let's say you have 16 people you're working with, and you might give them a question to talk through. So in this particular case, let's say the communication in the department is not really as good as it could be. So we might throw the question to the group and say, hey, how could our communication improve? And what people do is they'll spend, at each table, they'll spend about 20 minutes talking to each other about how they could make improvements. And typically what works well is when you cover that table up with paper, people can doodle, they can make notes right on top of the table. And that gets them kind of excited about and kind of using the other side of their brain sometimes to get creative about how the communication could improve in their group. And then what you do is you have a host at each table, and that host stays put, but the other participants, after about 20 minutes, you signal them to get up and to randomly go to another table. And this is where the cross-pollination takes place, where people start to randomly now get together. They engage on the same question, but there are different people at the table now. And the host's job at this point is to kind of recap what was discussed at the table before, and then to, get the participants to talk about the same question. And on paper, it might sound a little redundant, but a lot of really rich, deep, interesting stuff occurs at this point in time. And you do that about 3 to 4 times. And at the end, you have this, what we call the harvesting session, where you get all of the great ideas and the themes that come out from everybody that was participating on, in this particular case, how could the communication improve within the group? And then that kind of becomes your action item that comes out of the discussion. So again, a great way to re-engage people and get them excited about what they could do and how they could improve as a group. And you really empower them to do that on their own. So it's really a fun item to try with a group that might need some help. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about how we measure engagement. There are really 3 main categories. These were at first pioneered by the Gallup organization, the same one you might see doing presidential polls and other data gathering. But a lot of organizations now do surveys with companies, and they try to measure and categorize employees in these 3 buckets. One would be the fully engaged or the committed group. These are the ones that are using that discretionary effort and are really excited and committed to their jobs. The middle group is what we call not engaged, and these are the ones that are ambivalent. Sort of the sleepwalkers at work is a term sometimes I use to describe this group. They comply with doing the minimum of what's required in their job, but they're probably not going to go above and beyond because they're sort of there maybe counting the hours and clocking in. And then you have the actively disengaged group. So these are the people that are really, they might be the complainers, they might be looking for other jobs, they're really upset in some particular way. And this is how we typically categorize employees into these 3 buckets. And then we kind of have something that we can work with from there. So some examples, I kind of went through some of these a little bit before, so I'll whip through these. But when people are fully engaged, you might see them reaching out to help other coworkers. They're being very proactive about what they do. They're really, really excited to come into work in the morning. And they're really there to do whatever it takes to make the organization better in the long run. And then examples of disengage, again, the sleepwalkers at work. These are the people that are compliant. They're told what to do and they'll do it, but they're maybe not willing to come up with new ideas and new exciting ways of doing different things because they're not fully engaged like the previous group that we talked about. And then lastly, we have examples of actively disengaged behaviors. And again, these are the people that you might find complaining. They might dislike their boss. They might just really be upset in some particular way. They might be in the HR office a lot. You could probably pick these employees out pretty quickly. So that's how we categorize, and we'll come back to that here in a second when we talk about some macro measurements of engagement in the American workforce. But before we do that, let's just quickly touch on the historical underpinnings of engagement. So where did it come from? How did we get here? So really in the 1980s, organizational experts started talking about the level of employee satisfaction. There were some polls and surveys being done at that time, focus groups, that type of thing, to start to really get a handle on how does the overall organization's level of employee satisfaction look. And then in 1990, Dr. Kahn introduced the concept of employee engagement in a seminal article that he published in Psychology Today. And he coined the term employee engagement. And from there, the whole field has really taken off. Gallup started their employee survey they call the Q12 survey. They started doing worldwide back in 1995. And I'll show you some data from Gallup here in a second. And then the Society for Human Resource Management published their first major article in 2006. And here today, ISO, some of you may be familiar with that. They're really well known in the quality circles where they've established international standards for quality that companies can get certified for. They're now working to establish international standards on employee engagement and human resource practices. So I think that this ongoing excitement around employee engagement is really going to continue. I don't think it's a passing fad because there's a lot of work that's going into making this and figuring it out for organizations. So measuring engagement, as I promised, here's some of the results from Gallup, for example. We can get these from different organizations, but unfortunately, over the last 20 years, the overall engagement levels in the United States have not really changed that much. And I say unfortunately because really only about 30% to a third of our workers in the US workforce are fully engaged. And about 18% are actively disengaged. So those are the people we talked about earlier about the complainers looking for other jobs, most likely to leave the organization, might even be working against the organization. And then a whopping 52% of workers are just disengaged, the sleepwalkers, So they may have been inspired and excited at one point in their career, but they're not anymore. And this is collected and developed through the Gallup Q12 survey data. But if you look at other organizations that collect data on employee engagement, unfortunately, the level of engagement is quite low overall. And it's an area that I think is ripe for improvement. And we could certainly do a better job. There are other ways to measure engagement as well. In addition to surveys, which is the most common, about 70% of organizations do surveys today. But organizational experts will do focus groups sometimes with employees. They'll do interviews. They'll use technology to monitor engagement with people with their benefits programs and other employee related programs. So there are a lot of fun things that can be done to try to measure engagement. But like I said earlier, we haven't been able to figure out how to really move the needle up over the last 20 years on making the work environment more engaging for employees. So why does employee engagement matter? Well, there are a lot of studies that show that employee engagement is highly correlated to results. So one company, for example, here looked at the overall return of the stock market. The S&P 500 is the 500 largest companies traded on the stock exchange. And if you took the 50 best companies out of that S&P 500, you can see that they, for a long period of time, have returned a higher rate to their shareholders. There are investment groups now that are asking companies to reveal their employee engagement scores and their employee practices before they invest in them. So publicly traded companies are starting to pay more attention to this. And as I mentioned earlier, the ISO International Standards Organization is working on an international standard for engagement worldwide. And again, there are countless studies that engagement just has such a positive effect on the bottom line and on productivity in the workplace. For example, SHRM did a pretty extensive study showing that fully engaged employees perform 20% better and are 87% less likely to leave than just their peer group. So we have that. These environments are typically safer. They return more to their shareholders. There's just all kinds of good things that happen when we can find an organization that has a highly engaged workforce. And why does it work? So there are a couple different reasons. When we look at the drivers of engagement, we look at people that feel appreciated. So this kind of goes to the social exchange theory. A supervisor or organization that gives employees special recognition, rewards, flexibility, and trust. The employee feels obligated to pay that back when they receive this type of treatment from their workplace with their extra effort, extra discretionary time and effort that they're going to give back to the organization. And then, of course, employee engagement really spills over into customer engagement. So you probably can tell a highly engaged workforce when you walk into a retail store versus one where maybe the employees aren't quite as engaged because people seem really happy to be there. They're going to go out of their way to help you. Those are highly engaged workforces, and that creates more customer loyalty. And then lastly, the socioeconomic approach to management is a change theory that was pioneered in Europe, and they've done about 2,000 interventions. And they have found that dysfunctions, kind of going back to the disengaged workforce, cost the average organization about $24,000 per employee per year in actual cost of wasted time, bad quality, the list goes on and on. So it's a group out of France that has done a lot of work to create a database to prove that improvements can be made and there are costs that are occurring in disengaged workforces. So that kind of concludes the content of our talk today. We wanted to kind of keep this to about 20 to 30 minutes, but I also wanted to make you aware that because of your participation today, we're offering a free pulse survey for your department or organization. I would be happy to do with no obligation. And part of that is to hopefully put you on the path to becoming a more engaged group or overall organization. So the way this would work is I'll follow up with each of you after the webinar with an email. And I'll work personally with you to do an initial consultation if you're interested in moving forward with this. This is where we just agree on logistics and who's going to be surveyed on the goals and that type of thing. And then my organization, Transcend Engagement, will actually conduct the survey and provide the results back to you in a report. And again, that's done at no obligation, no cost. And hopefully that gives you a good starting point to make some improvements in your own organization if you are interested in pursuing that. So you'll see an email from me shortly, and we would be happy to follow up and make that happen for you. So I think with that, what we would love to do is to see if anybody has any questions, and I would encourage you to use the chat field at this point. And for those of you that need to get back to your regular jobs, feel free to go on to the rest of your day as well. Okay, well, nobody's popped in with any questions. I would like to thank everybody for attending. And again, if you want to follow up with any questions later, one-on-one, I'm happy to entertain those. And we can do those through email and follow-up phone call if necessary. So thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great day.